Good evening, dear viewers, and welcome to tonight's journey through the gilded halls of Versailles. A journey not just into the past, but into a time of extraordinary change, intrigue, and the shifting tides of history. As we walk these corridors, full of whispers and secrets, we'll uncover the tale of a kingdom on the brink of revolution, where the fate of a nation rested in the hands of those who would dare to challenge the old order. In the coming moments, you'll find yourselves immersed in the palace's opulence, its beauty, and its looming fragility. We'll delve deep into the lives of the courtiers, those men and women whose lives were built on ambition, power, and deception, and whose choices shaped the future of a country. Among them is Philippe, a man caught in the web of courtly politics and revolution. His journey is one of uncertainty and resolve, a reflection of the times in which he lived, times when the palace was not just a symbol of glory, but a powder keg waiting to explode. As the king's health falters and the whispers of rebellion grow louder, Versailles becomes more than just a seat of power. It becomes a battleground. And here, amidst the opulent decadence, a question looms. Can the kingdom be saved, or will it burn, consumed by the very forces it once sought to control? We will witness the rise of new alliances, the unraveling of old loyalties, and the birth of a new era that will change the very fabric of French society. But to understand the revolution that follows, we must first understand the palace that stood at its heart. So join me as we uncover the secrets of Versailles and the figures who dare to rewrite history. Tonight, we embark on a journey into a world that has long since faded, but whose echoes still resonate through time. Let's step into the past together, shall we? When the king retired, the palace didn't sleep, it whispered. The silence of Versailles at night was not the quiet of rest, but one laden with unspoken histories and secrets. The grand halls, once filled with the sounds of lively courtiers and the rustling of silk gowns, now stood in a haunting stillness, barely touched by the faint flicker of candlelight. The opulent rooms, so accustomed to the grandeur of the king's presence, seemed almost forgotten as the palace began to exhale a quiet sigh. The corridors, dimly lit by the soft glow of waxen flames, stretched endlessly. Each flicker of candlelight cast long, shivering shadows over tapestries that had witnessed centuries of courtly life, of joy and betrayal, of whispered conspiracies and unspoken alliances. In the absence of the king's commanding presence, the palace had taken on a life of its own, a stillness that felt both heavy and expectant. It was a place where nothing ever truly stopped, not even in the dead of night. Servants moved through the halls like phantoms, their soft footsteps barely disturbing the thick silence. They were the ones who knew the palace's most intimate secrets, those not recorded in the annals of history, but whispered in the dimly lit chambers and forgotten corners of Versailles. Their lives, like the palace itself, were a series of quiet rituals. The flicker of their lanterns was the only trace they left in the sprawling estate. They knew how to slip unnoticed through the long hallways, the hidden staircases, the narrow doorways that no noble would dare tread. These were the paths known only to those who had spent years as invisible witnesses to the royalty's endless drama. Though the king had retired for the night, the palace did not rest. It was as though it had its own pulse, a heart that beat not for a king, but for something far older. A clock somewhere deep in the palace chimed softly, the sound echoing down the marble corridors. It was not an urgent call, but one that measured time unhurriedly, almost lazily, as though each tick of the clock was merely a reminder of the inevitability of things. Every hallway felt alive with the presence of the past, with the faint echoes of footsteps long gone. You could almost hear the laughter of the court from centuries ago, the flutter of dresses and whispered conversations as if the walls themselves remembered the grandeur of Versailles in its prime. Despite the hush of the night, the pulse of the palace never faded. The murmurs of the court had not ceased, only quieted. In the king's absence, they gathered in the shadowed corners of their chambers, speaking in hushed voices. The nobles had long since stopped pretending to sleep. They were drawn together by a common thread of uncertainty, each face reflecting the same quiet questions. What would the future hold? What changes would the new era bring? Would the prince follow in his father's footsteps, or would he forge his own path? These were not simple questions. They were questions laden with ambition, with the kind of hope that could only thrive in the shadow of great power. The nobles had tasted the wealth and influence that came with proximity to the throne, and now they watched, almost impatiently, for any sign of what might come next. Would the young prince, groomed in the shadow of his father, carry the burden of tradition and rule, or would the winds of change blow through Versailles, scattering its long-established order? The king, who had once commanded the halls of Versailles with iron authority, now lay silent in his chamber, the soft, rhythmic sound of his breath, the only indication of life within his royal bed. His illness had left him frail, unable to govern in the way he once had. The courtiers whispered among themselves, eyes flicking nervously to the dark corners of the room where shadows seemed to gather and shift. Even the servants had begun to wonder if the king would last the night. They were not fools. They knew what this moment meant. The great palace, so accustomed to the weight of its regal occupants, now seemed fragile. And in its fragility lay the possibility of a new order, an order that no one could predict. Outside the palace, the moon rose high, casting its silvery light over the gardens, the statues standing motionless beneath the sky. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, a floral reminder that even in the midst of uncertainty, beauty could endure. The garden, always a place of quiet reflection, seemed to whisper of its own kind of resistance. The stillness of the night could not erase the presence of the living. Flowers bloomed and withered, statues aged, but everything, even the stone, seemed to carry on, as if to remind anyone who might listen that change, while inevitable, was not always immediate. The palace was vast, and in its vastness it seemed to breathe. The creaking of floorboards, the soft flutter of curtains, the rustle of silk gowns as servants passed, all spoke of a quiet rhythm that pulsed through the heart of Versailles. It was a rhythm that had endured for generations, a steady march through time that had seen kings rise and fall, seen the court shift and change, and yet, somehow, it never truly faltered. It whispered in the cracks of the walls, in the quiet hum of the tapestries, in the very bones of the palace. And as the night wore on, the palace seemed to know something that the people within it did not yet understand. It knew that change was coming, and that the heart of Versailles would continue to beat, no matter what would come to pass. In the distance, the faint murmur of voices rose from the court as the nobles gathered once again. Their conversations had grown bolder, filled with speculation, and yet still cautious, as if they feared their words might be overheard. The future of Versailles hung in the balance. As the king slept, those who remained in the palace sensed that they were living on the edge of a great unknown. No one could predict what the next day might bring, whether the prince would emerge from the shadow of his father and rise to take the throne, or whether another would seize the opportunity, shifting the power dynamics that had defined Versailles for generations. The servants, meanwhile, continued their work in the shadows. They knew the palace better than anyone. They had seen it all, the rise and fall of kings, the whispered betrayals, the subtle shifts in power that no noble would ever acknowledge. They knew that history was not made in the great halls or in the eyes of the public, but in the quiet moments between one breath and the next, in the spaces where only those who lived in the shadows could truly see. The scent of wax, of perfume, of silk filled the air as they moved through the halls. The palace was like a living creature, each step, each gesture carrying with it a weight of meaning. Every room, every corner held its own story, and the servants were the ones who carried those stories in their hearts. They were the keepers of the palace's secrets, the ones who listened to the whispers in the night. And though the king rested in his chamber, the pulse of Versailles continued, alive in every flicker of candlelight and every whispered conversation. Somewhere in the vast expanse of Versailles, the heart of the palace continued to beat, a rhythm that promised continuity amidst change. The king may have retired, but the palace never truly did. It lived on, its stories, its whispers, its secrets, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The vast expanse of Versailles was quiet in the hours after the sun had set. In the chambers where the servants rested between their shifts, the noise of the day had long since faded. The stillness was thick, almost suffocating. Marie, a young chambermaid who had spent countless nights working under the flickering light of oil lamps, wiped the sweat from her brow and sighed. Her duties had been completed, her hands ached from the day's chores, and her back was sore from carrying baskets of linens up and down the grand staircase. But sleep was not yet an option. It was during the night that the true nature of the palace revealed itself. She had learned this long ago. The day at Versailles was a whirlwind of activity, of courtiers prancing in silk gowns, of the king's chambers brimming with attendants and musicians. But at night, the palace transformed. The grand hallways, lined with velvet curtains and polished marble floors, stood in oppressive quiet. It was as though the walls themselves were alive in the darkness, their quiet hum beckoning to anyone willing to listen. Even now, as Marie moved silently through the corridors, she felt the weight of it, the palpable sense that something always stirred within these walls. Her soft steps, barely audible on the smooth floors, made her feel like a trespasser. The palace seemed to notice her every move. It was not just the marble, the tapestries, or the old creaking doors that filled her senses, but a presence, a feeling that she was not alone. It had taken years for Marie to understand the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in the air. Silence, she had learned, was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something waiting. 1,000 secrets were buried just below the surface, hidden within the very stones of the palace, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the slightest disturbance to come rushing forward. She paused for a moment in the grand corridor, her eyes drawn to the flickering light of a nearby candle, casting a faint glow on the tapestries that lined the walls. The figures in the woven scenes seemed to come alive in the shadows, their intricate details shifting as though the past itself was stretching and reaching into the present. It was in these moments that Marie felt the palace most keenly. The smell of old wood, velvet, and candle wax mixed with the faintest scent of lavender from the gardens outside. But it was the sound, or lack thereof, that truly filled her senses. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something to happen. The air was thick with the history of the place, a history of those who had lived and loved, who had schemed and betrayed, who had passed through these halls long before her. To be a servant at Versailles was to be both a witness and a ghost, unnoticed by the noble families who called it their home, yet deeply intertwined with the essence of the palace. As she moved through the darkened hallways, Marie could not help but wonder about the stories that had unfolded in these spaces. The other servants had their tales, shared quietly between chores or over shared meals, Stories of hidden passageways, of forgotten rooms tucked away behind false walls. There were tales of treasures hidden by the nobles of old, of lost jewels stashed in secret compartments, waiting for someone brave enough to seek them out. Some whispered of ghosts, too stubborn to leave souls trapped in the very stones of the palace, seeking rest that never came. She had often sat in the servants' quarters, listening to these tales with a mix of skepticism and intrigue, her imagination painting vivid pictures of what might lie hidden within the palace's depths. Yet, despite the allure of such stories, Marie found herself more captivated by the everyday echoes of those who had once graced these halls. The laughter of children playing in the gardens, the soft strains of music drifting from the ballroom, the quiet conversations held in shadowed alcoves, these were the ghosts she felt most acutely. They lingered in the air, a gentle reminder of the lives once lived here, of the joys and sorrows woven into the very fabric of the palace. Marie continued down the corridor, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets beneath her feet. She found comfort in the routine of her duties, in the rhythmic repetition of tasks that connected her to a lineage of caretakers before her. As she polished the ornate banisters, swept the grand staircases, and ensured every room was pristine, she felt a part of something much larger than herself, a living thread in the tapestry of Versailles. It was in these quiet moments that she allowed herself the luxury of dreaming of what her future might hold, of adventures beyond the gilded walls. But for now, she was content to be a part of the palace's ongoing story, a silent witness to its history, and perhaps, in some small way, a guardian of its secrets. Marie had always dismissed these tales as fanciful myths, nothing more than idle chatter meant to break the monotony of endless work. But on nights like this, when the darkness pressed in closer, the silence deeper, and the palace seemed to breathe with a life of its own, she found herself wondering, what if there was some truth to it? What if the stories were more than just that? A way to pass the time in the quiet hours, to give shape to the unsettling stillness. What if the walls really did remember? The thought was unsettling, but before Marie could dwell too much on it, something pulled her attention back to the present. A soft creak echoed through the hallway, faint but distinct. The sound sliced through the stillness, making her heart skip a beat. She froze, instinctively turning toward the source of the noise, her pulse quickening. The sound of a door, perhaps, or the shift of a floorboard underfoot. For a moment, she stood still, her eyes darting through the shadows, searching for any movement. But there was nothing. No figure emerging from the darkness. No rustling of silk or the faint sound of footsteps. Just the long stretch of the corridor, empty and silent as ever. Her breath slowed, though her heart still raced, pounding in her chest. She exhaled deeply, trying to shake off the creeping unease that had settled in her stomach. Perhaps it was just the house itself, settling into its nightly rhythm, the sound of old wood giving way under the weight of time. Still, the quiet did little to reassure her. The sensation that she was being watched didn't dissipate. There was something about the palace at night that unsettled her, something about the way the shadows seemed to move on their own, the way the silence clung to the stone walls like a secret. A part of her knew she should turn back, head to her quarters, find comfort in the warmth of her small bed. She had been working tirelessly all day, and the weight of sleep was calling to her. But the other part, the part of her that had always been curious, that longed to understand the hidden layers of Versailles, urged her forward. She had walked these halls hundreds of times, but tonight she felt an inexplicable pull, a sense that there was something more waiting for her, something that only those brave enough to seek it would ever discover. With a deep breath, Marie straightened herself, trying to push away the discomfort that had settled into her bones. She continued on her way, moving carefully through the palace, stepping lightly on the cool marble floors. She passed through grand archways that seemed to stretch endlessly, and under chandeliers that flickered, casting ghostly shadows in the corners of the room. The sound of her own footsteps seemed loud in the otherwise still palace, and yet each echo felt like an intrusion in the otherwise perfect silence. As she moved deeper into the palace, she came to the grand staircase, a sweeping structure of marble and gold. It was here, more than anywhere else, that the grandeur of Versailles seemed to come alive. The staircase, with its grand arches and gilded railings, was the very heart of the palace. But tonight, it seemed different. The air felt cooler, the shadows deeper. It was as though the palace itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Marie paused at the top of the staircase and peered down into the vast hall below. The flickering candles cast faint reflections in the polished marble, creating a ghostly dance of light and shadow. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost unreal. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply stand there, mesmerized by the sight. The quiet, the stillness, the sense that time itself had paused in this moment, everything was suspended. But as the silence stretched on, she felt the pull once more, the call to continue. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just out of sight, something buried beneath the layers of history, hidden within the walls of Versailles. With a last lingering glance down the grand staircase, she turned and walked deeper into the palace, following the dim glow of candlelight. The night was still young, and who knew what secrets it might reveal to those brave enough to seek them. The palace, for all its beauty and opulence, was more than just a place of wealth and power. It was a living, breathing entity, its past, its history, its heart waiting for someone to uncover the mysteries it had kept hidden for so long. And tonight, Marie was determined to find out what those mysteries were. For in the silence of Versailles, in the hidden corners and forgotten rooms, stories waited to be told. And Marie, with her heart beating faster with every step, was ready to listen. The moon hung low over the royal gardens, its pale light casting long, eerie shadows that stretched across the manicured paths. Philippe, a young courtier, moved quietly through the night, his steps almost soundless as he walked alone under the canopy of darkened trees. The garden, usually vibrant with the laughter and chatter of the court, was now an empty expanse of silence. The court had retreated to their chambers hours ago, leaving the vast estate to the cool embrace of the night, and yet Philippe could not find rest. His mind was restless, buzzing with thoughts of rumors, whispers, and things hidden away from the king's gaze. There were secrets in the air tonight, secrets that seemed to pulse beneath the stillness of Versailles like a living thing. The scent of damp earth mingled with the heady perfume of blooming jasmine. As Philippe wandered deeper into the garden, his eyes scanning the surroundings, seeking something. He had heard the murmurs in the servants' quarters, overheard hushed conversations in the hallways. There were things, dark things, spoken only in shadows. Some said the king's health was failing, that a plot was brewing beneath the surface, one that could change the very foundation of the court. Others spoke of hidden rooms, secret passageways that the royals themselves knew nothing about, places where whispers of rebellion took root. Philippe didn't know which rumors were true, but he knew one thing for certain. The palace held mysteries, and he was determined to uncover them. His feet carried him towards the fountain, its still waters reflecting the moonlight in a shimmering glass-like surface. He paused at the edge of the marble basin, gazing down at the ripples in the water as though seeking answers within the depths. But it wasn't the moon's reflection that captured his attention. It was the flicker of light from a distant window, the faint glow of a candle burning in the darkness. Someone was still awake, someone who knew more than they let on. The candle's soft light beckoned to him like a lighthouse in the night, pulling him toward whatever lay hidden in the shadowed corners of the palace. His heart quickened with anticipation, and he found himself holding his breath, as though he feared the very night would reveal itself. The soft, cool breeze that ruffled the leaves of the trees did nothing to calm the nervous fluttering in his chest. He had come this far, there would be no turning back now. Philippe's steps quickened, each one a silent commitment to the path he had chosen. He made his way toward the source of the candlelight, navigating the twisting, overgrown paths with practiced ease, his mind racing with possibilities. As he drew closer to the old library, the ancient structure that housed the secrets of the court, he saw the door slightly ajar. A sliver of light leaked from the crack, casting a faint glow on the stone threshold. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of the unknown pressing on him, but his resolve remained unshaken. Philippe gently pushed the door open, the ancient hinges protesting with a soft groan, as though the building itself was reluctant to reveal its secrets. The door swung inward, and he stepped into the dimly lit room. The scent of old parchment and leather-bound tomes hit him immediately, a familiar and comforting smell, one that always brought him a sense of calm amidst the chaos of court life. But tonight, even the comfort of the library couldn't quell the unease gnawing at the edges of his mind. The room was dim, with only a single candle illuminating the center of the room, casting flickering shadows across the rows of bookshelves. The walls, lined with ancient volumes, seemed to stretch upward, filled with the weight of knowledge accumulated over centuries. It was a space where the past and present collided, where secrets were not just kept, but preserved. At the large oak table in the center of the room sat Lady Isabel, the king's most trusted advisor. Her eyes were sharp and perceptive, always watching, always calculating. She was a fixture of the court, known for her intelligence, her influence, and her ability to sway the decisions of even the most powerful men. When she looked up from the pages in front of her, her gaze met Philippe's with a mixture of surprise and amusement. "Philippe," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper, "I did not expect to find you here at such an hour." Philippe stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He had been prepared for the possibility of being caught, but he hadn't anticipated that it would be Isabel. She was not someone easily fooled. He felt the weight of his curiosity pressing against his conscience, the need to justify his presence here. "I couldn't sleep," Philippe said, his voice low and steady. It was a half-truth, but one that seemed to work. "There are things I need to understand." Isabel raised an eyebrow, an unreadable expression crossing her face. Without a word, she gestured to the chair across from her, inviting him to sit. Philippe hesitated, but then moved toward the table and lowered himself onto the chair. As he did, Isabel's gaze never left him. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers absently tracing the edge of a leather-bound book in front of her, as if contemplating something far more complicated than a simple conversation. "The palace holds many secrets," Isabel said after a moment, her voice steady but tinged with something that felt almost like warning. "But not all of them are meant to be uncovered." Philippe nodded, his curiosity burning brighter with each passing second. Isabel's words were cryptic, but he could feel the truth of them. He had known the palace was full of secrets. He had sensed them since the moment he first set foot in Versailles. But what was she trying to tell him? That some things should remain hidden? That the truth might be more dangerous than he realized? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the silence settle between them, broken only by the quiet rustle of the pages as Isabel turned them. Philippe knew what he had to say. The question that had been plaguing him for weeks, the reason he had come here tonight, I need to know what's hidden from us, he said, his voice low but firm. I need to understand what's really going on here. Isabel's lips curled into a faint smile, as though she had expected this from him. Her eyes flickered to the candlelight, the shadows dancing across her face as she considered his words. The air between them felt thick with unspoken tension. A moment passed, then another, before Isabel's gaze returned to Philippe. Her voice was softer now, almost conspiratorial, as she leaned forward slightly. Very well, she said, her words deliberate, but be prepared. The truth is seldom as simple as it seems. Philippe nodded, leaning closer to the table, his heart beating in anticipation. This was it. This was what he had been searching for. Isabel opened the leather-bound ledger in front of her, revealing pages filled with intricate diagrams and cryptic notations. The pages were old, the ink faded in some places, but still legible. Philippe's eyes widened as he scanned the pages, the complexity of the diagrams making his head spin. There were drawings of rooms, hidden corridors, even what appeared to be a map of the palace itself. His pulse quickened as he realized that this was no ordinary book. It was a record, perhaps the record of everything hidden within Versailles, a map to the secrets of the palace. As he leaned closer, Isabel's voice broke the silence again, this time softer, almost reverent. These are the things that are meant to stay hidden, Philippe, she said. These are the mysteries that could change everything. Philippe's eyes flickered over the pages, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the cryptic symbols and diagrams. But one thing was clear. Tonight, the palace had begun to reveal its most closely guarded secrets, and Philippe was about to uncover them. Philippe walked through the vast hallways of Versailles, drawn by an invisible force toward the grand ballroom. The palace, bathed in the dim glow of flickering candlelight, seemed quiet, almost expectant. The air was thick with history, the very stones and walls heavy with the weight of the past. The grandeur of the ballroom, once alive with music, laughter, and swirling silk gowns, now stood silent. Its majesty was muted in the pale light, its opulence softened by the darkness of the night. The marble floors stretched out before Philippe like a river of pale stone, guiding him toward the heart of the palace. Each step he took seemed to echo in the vastness, the silence around him almost deafening. As he moved further into the room, Philippe couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The vast space seemed to hold its breath, as if on the edge of something just beyond reach, something teetering on the verge of unraveling. The ballroom, despite its beauty, felt like a place that was losing its purpose, its splendor fading like an old painting, its brushstrokes beginning to blur. The walls, adorned with tapestries that had witnessed centuries of courtly life, seemed to sag under the weight of forgotten memories. The chandeliers, once glistening with the light of 1,000 candles, now hung heavy and dim, as if weary of their own grandeur. Philippe's eyes swept over the room, noticing the quiet corners where the shadows had taken refuge. The faint flicker of a candle from across the ballroom caught his attention. Someone else was here. Someone who didn't belong. A chill crept up his spine as his heart quickened. His instincts told him that this was no coincidence. The room was empty, yet the candle's light, the soft glow illuminating only a sliver of the room, suggested otherwise. He took a few more cautious steps, the silence wrapping around him, thick and oppressive. His footsteps were soft, but they still seemed too loud in the stillness, reverberating against the cold stone floors. He scanned the shadows, his eyes darting from one corner to the next, searching for the source of the disturbance. The room, though magnificent, seemed to hold its breath as if it too was watching. He could almost feel the palace itself holding its secrets close, as if daring him to uncover them. "Who's there?" Philippe called out, his voice steady despite the sudden unease settling in his chest. It felt like a rhetorical question, but the room responded only with silence. There was no movement, no sound beyond the whispering shadows. The candle flickered again, casting an eerie light across the walls, the dancing shadows now taking on strange, shifting forms that seemed to move of their own accord. A figure emerged from the darkness, stepping forward with an air of quiet grace. The stranger's attire was dark, blending seamlessly with the dim surroundings. It was as though the figure had materialized from the shadows themselves, the folds of their cloak billowing around them like smoke. Their face was partially obscured by the dim light, but Philippe could see their eyes sharp, alert, and filled with a glint of something unfamiliar. "I could ask you the same question," the stranger said, their voice low and gravelly, laced with an accent Philippe couldn't quite place. It wasn't one he had heard often in the court, and there was something in the way the stranger spoke that intrigued him. "This place holds many secrets, and not all are meant to be uncovered." "Oh." Philippe's heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm, squaring his shoulders and meeting the stranger's gaze. He could sense that this encounter was no mere accident. There was purpose here, and he was determined to uncover it. "I'm here to ensure the safety of this palace and its history," Philippe said, his voice steady and unwavering. "Who are you, and what is your purpose here?" The stranger hesitated for a moment, as if weighing the truth of their words. They seemed to study Philippe for a long, drawn-out moment, their eyes assessing him with a quiet intensity that was both unnerving and compelling. Finally, they spoke again, their tone more measured this time. "I am a seeker of truths, much like yourself," the stranger replied. "My purpose is not one of harm, but of understanding. The past has a way of calling to those who have the ears to hear it." Philippe's brow furrowed. The stranger's words struck a chord deep within him, resonating in a way that he couldn't quite explain. He had long known that there was more to the palace than met the eye, more to its history and the stories it held within its walls. He had always sensed that there was something just beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. Perhaps this stranger, too, was on a similar quest, drawn by the same hunger for knowledge. A strange sense of familiarity began to creep over Philippe. There was something about the stranger's presence, their words, that felt oddly comforting. Could it be that they were not so different after all? Were they both driven by the same insatiable curiosity, the same yearning to uncover what had been hidden from view? The idea felt right, as if the moment had been leading him here all along. Philippe stepped closer, his voice softer now, more open. "Then let us seek together," he said, his words carrying the weight of an unspoken agreement. "For the tapestry of this place is woven with stories, and it seems we both wish to see it unfold." The stranger regarded him for a moment, their eyes studying him carefully. It was as though they were testing him, gauging his sincerity, his resolve. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they nodded, their posture relaxing. A silent agreement had been forged between them, a bond formed not through words but through a shared understanding of the world they both sought to uncover. And so they began to move together through the ballroom, the silence broken only by the soft sound of their footsteps on the marble floor. With every step they took, the room seemed to open up before them, as if it too had been waiting for them to arrive. The flickering candlelight illuminated their path, casting long shadows along the walls, shadows that seemed to shift and move with them as they explored. The grand mirrors, once gleaming with the reflection of royalty, now stood dark, their glass surfaces dusty with the passage of time. The tapestries, rich with color and history, fluttered slightly in the breeze, their intricate patterns telling stories that had long been forgotten by those who no longer walked these halls. Philippe ran his fingers along the edges of one tapestry, his mind racing with thoughts of the past. What had this room seen? What had it witnessed in the days when it was filled with life, with music and laughter? As they moved deeper into the heart of the ballroom, Philippe could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. Each corner of the room imbued with the stories of those who had come before. It was as though the ballroom itself was alive, breathing with the memories of its past. The air was thick with the presence of those long gone, their spirits lingering in the very fabric of the room. The stranger too seemed lost in thought, their eyes scanning the walls, the floor, the ceiling, as though they were searching for something, perhaps something that had eluded them for years. They didn't speak, but the intensity of their gaze was enough to say that they too were on the edge of something important, something transformative. With each passing moment, the feeling of discovery grew stronger. The mysteries of the palace were beginning to unfold, one step at a time. The stranger's presence, once enigmatic, was now a comforting companion on this shared journey into the unknown. Together, they were peeling back the layers of history, uncovering the truths that had been buried for so long. The darkness of the ballroom no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it felt like an invitation. The shadows whispered secrets to them, secrets that were eager to be heard, eager to be uncovered. With each flicker of the candle, the stories of Versailles came to life, revealing themselves in the shifting light and the fading echoes of the past. Philippe's heart raced with anticipation. He had found his ally in the shadows, and together they would unravel the mysteries of the palace. The tapestry of Versailles was far from complete, and tonight they would witness it unfold, one hidden truth at a time. Philippe's heart raced in his chest as he followed the faint flicker of light down the cold, silent corridors of Versailles. The soft glow illuminated the stone walls, casting long, eerie shadows that stretched out before him, threatening to engulf him in darkness. His breath was shallow, barely a whisper against the vast quiet of the palace, and each step seemed louder than the last. The familiar rhythm of the palace guard's footsteps, heavy and purposeful, was absent tonight. In its place, there was a different kind of sound. The soft, deliberate padding of feet that seemed to move with careful intention, as though the person knew exactly where they were going and how to remain unseen. Philippe pressed himself against the cold stone wall, his body tense as he tried to make sense of the situation. He had been wandering the palace after midnight, driven by a restless curiosity, when he had noticed the flicker of candlelight coming from a hallway not far ahead. That light was the only sign of life in the otherwise empty palace. Unable to resist, he had followed, his instincts telling him that something important was unfolding just out of sight. Now, as the footsteps drew closer, he could see the figure emerging from the shadows, slender, almost ghost-like in the dim light. The figure moved silently, with the grace of someone accustomed to secrecy. Before Philippe could react, the person slipped behind a tapestry, vanishing into a hidden chamber. Philippe's curiosity surged. His mind raced, but he dared not make a sound. He knew the palace better than most, every nook, every cranny, but even he had never encountered this secret passage before. He took a deep breath, pushing the thoughts of caution aside, and followed. His footsteps were quiet as he crept toward the door, positioning himself so he could listen without being seen. Inside, the air felt heavier, thick with secrets. The only source of light was a single candle resting on a table, casting flickering shadows across the room's stone walls. Philippe could barely make out the outlines of bookshelves stacked with old volumes and the dim, crumbling furniture that filled the space. This was a far cry from the splendor of the royal chambers. It was small, almost claustrophobic, a stark contrast to the grandiosity of Versailles, yet the atmosphere inside felt charged with something much more dangerous than mere antiquity. Philippe held his breath as he strained to listen, careful not to make a sound. The conversation inside the room was low, hushed, the words drifting toward him like whispers caught in the wind. He could hear snippets of voices, too muffled to make out at first, but then one word rose above the rest, clear and unmistakable: rebellion. Philippe's pulse quickened. His blood ran cold. He was not mistaken. He had heard correctly. There, in the hidden depths of the palace, conspirators were planning something far more sinister than any court intrigue or scandal. This was no mere whisper of political maneuvering. This was a plot to overthrow the monarchy itself. The voices became clearer now, each word, like a hammer, striking against the walls of the room. The conspirators spoke of a future without the king, of a new order for France. There was talk of rallies, of gatherings in secret rooms, of alliances being formed in the shadows. The words were chilling more than Philippe had ever imagined. His thoughts whirled, each one more disturbing than the last. The kingdom was at a crossroads, but what path was it about to take? He knew that whatever decision he made, it would be a defining moment both for the nation and for him. As Philippe strained to hear more, one voice broke through the others. It was a woman's voice, low and steady, with a sharpness that cut through the air. Philippe's heart skipped a beat when he recognized it. It was Madame Leclerc, one of the king's most trusted advisors. Her presence in this clandestine meeting shocked him to his core. She had always been a figure of stability within the court, someone who had earned the king's trust. But now, it seemed, she was a part of something far darker. The reality of her involvement in this conspiracy made Philippe's blood run colder still. If someone like Madame Leclerc, someone so close to the king, was involved, then the conspiracy reached deeper than he had ever imagined. Her voice was the one that held the room together, commanding attention as she spoke of plans to weaken the monarchy, of alliances that would reshape the very fabric of Versailles. Philippe could hear the quiet certainty in her tone. She was not just a follower in this plot, she was a leader, and the ramifications of her actions would be felt throughout the palace. Philippe's stomach churned. His first instinct was to leave, to retreat back into the shadows from whence he had come, but his legs wouldn't move. His feet were rooted to the stone floor, as if the very walls of the palace were holding him in place, forcing him to listen, forcing him to understand. The candlelight flickered once more, casting strange, elongated shadows along the walls. The room was almost suffocating in its quiet intensity. Philippe realized that he had stayed too long. If they discovered him, if they knew that he had overheard their plans, his life would be in danger. His name would be forever tainted, his career in the court obliterated. He had lingered too close to a secret that was never meant for his ears. The thought of discovery sent a shiver down his spine. His heart raced in his chest as he took a step back, moving as quietly as he could, his pulse pounding in his ears. The decision was not easy, and it was not one that could be made lightly. The knowledge he had gained here could alter the course of history itself, but it also placed him at the center of a dangerous web. If he exposed the plot, he might save the monarchy, but in doing so, he would betray those who fought for change, those who longed for a different kind of future. Could he live with the consequences of such a choice? And yet, to remain silent was to become complicit in something far darker. He could feel the weight of the future pressing against him, the weight of a choice that could determine the fate of an entire nation. Philippe took another slow, steadying breath as he began to retrace his steps, moving cautiously away from the hidden chamber. Each step he took was measured, deliberate, as though he feared the very walls would betray him. His mind was consumed with the knowledge he had gained, the burden of the truth pressing down on him. What should he do? What could he do? There was no easy answer. Once he had moved far enough, safely out of earshot, Philippe stopped. He stood in the hallway, his breath ragged, his mind reeling. He could still hear the faint echoes of the conspiracy in his head, their words lingering like a dark cloud. The palace was not just a house of splendor and beauty. It was a battleground, a place of intrigue and shadow. And now, Philippe was a part of it. Whether he liked it or not, he had been pulled into the very heart of the struggle for Versailles' future. His actions in the coming days would determine which side of history he would stand on. He knew that the stakes had never been higher. This meeting, this secret gathering in the hidden chamber, had changed everything. It was not just a turning point for the palace, but for him. Philippe had been given a choice, and he knew that this was the moment where his destiny would be forged. As he walked back through the labyrinthine halls of the palace, his mind raced. He had heard enough to understand the magnitude of what was at stake, but now he needed allies. He couldn't face this alone. Trust would be paramount, and he knew he had to move with the utmost discretion. One wrong step, and everything would unravel. But in that moment, as he walked through the corridors of Versailles, Philippe realized that the time for passivity had passed. He could no longer remain a spectator in this drama. The future of the palace, of France itself, was in his hands, and he would do whatever it took to change the course of history. With a final, determined glance over his shoulder, Philippe disappeared into the shadows of the palace, his heart heavy with the weight of the choices ahead. In the weeks that followed, something intangible began to hang in the air of Versailles, a quiet shift that no one could quite explain. The grandeur that had once defined the palace, its overwhelming opulence and decadent beauty, began to feel empty. What had once been a symbol of unshakable power, of wealth and excess, was slowly unraveling. The once vibrant court had grown quieter, its smiles more forced, its laughter more hollow. The king, their beloved monarch, was fading. His health had been failing for months, but now it was undeniable. His once commanding presence had withered into frailty, and with his decline, the very stability of Versailles seemed to waver. Philippe could feel it in the very stones beneath his feet. It wasn't just the king's sickness. It was something deeper, something more unsettling. It was as if the pulse of the palace had slowed. The courtiers who once filled the halls with their bustling movements and whispered intrigues now walked with a different air. They moved more cautiously, eyes flicking nervously, shoulders tense as if they too sensed the impending collapse. Whispers filled the air, rumors that had been brewing for weeks, now growing louder and more insistent. The whispers spoke of a power vacuum, of the king's imminent passing, and of the future that could no longer be avoided. Philippe, though often more withdrawn than most, had never been blind to the dynamics of the court. He had been raised in the shadow of Versailles' glittering facade, and though he was not yet a prominent figure in the royal circle, he had learned early that power was not just a matter of position, it was a matter of perception, of timing. And now, as the king lay ill in his chambers, surrounded by his most trusted advisors and physicians, the court had begun to shift, like a great ship caught in the pull of an unseen tide. In the royal chambers, the king was a shadow of his former self. He lay propped up by soft pillows, pale and frail, his once mighty form diminished by illness. His regal crown, which had once gleamed with the light of his power, now sat forgotten at the edge of the bedside, a silent testament to the inevitability of his decline. The courtiers, once eager to curry favor, now circled the king's chambers like vultures waiting for the inevitable. Their movements were quieter now, more restrained, as if every word they spoke might hasten the inevitable fall of the monarchy. Philippe watched from a distance, his heart heavy with a mix of dread and anticipation. He knew that with the king's demise, the delicate balance of power would shift, opening doors for those bold enough to seize the opportunity. And yet, he remained cautious, aware that the chaos of transition could be as perilous as it was promising. As he wandered through the echoing halls of Versailles, Philippe reflected on the nature of power. It was an elusive force, one that could transform allies into adversaries and friends into foes. The court was a living entity, its loyalties ever-changing, its alliances as fluid as the streams that flowed through the palace gardens. The queen, a figure of poise and resilience, had already begun to assert herself amidst the uncertainty. Her quiet strength was both admired and feared, her influence extending beyond the gilded walls of the court. Philippe admired her tenacity, though he understood that her path would not be without obstacles. The burdens of leadership were heavy, and the weight of expectation could crush even the strongest spirit. Outside, the gardens of Versailles bloomed in vibrant defiance of the somber mood inside. Nature, it seemed, cared little for the affairs of humans, its cycles continuing unabated. Philippe found solace in this constancy, a reminder that life would go on, regardless of the turmoil within the palace walls. As evening fell, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple, Philippe knew that the days ahead would be pivotal. Choices made now would reverberate through history, shaping the future of the kingdom and all who called it home. With a deep breath, he steeled himself for the challenges to come, determined to navigate the shifting sands of power with wisdom and grace. Philippe had seen it before, the subtle shifting of ambitions, the quiet maneuvering in the dark. The once glorious court was beginning to show its cracks, its foundations weakened by years of indulgence and self-interest. Some courtiers, always quick to sense opportunity, were already positioning themselves for the time when the king's power would be relinquished. But not all were so eager. Many feared what might come next. For them, the loss of the monarchy meant the loss of everything they had worked for: their position, their influence, their very way of life. Philippe found himself walking the halls of Versailles more often in recent days, his mind spinning with the gravity of what was unfolding. There were so many questions, so much uncertainty. The future of the palace, of the court, of the kingdom, everything was in flux. Some of the older courtiers spoke of the king's legacy, of how things were supposed to continue, how the monarchy was supposed to endure. But Philippe had come to understand that the world was never static. Change was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. Even the palace gardens, once a testament to human ingenuity, seemed to reflect the uncertainty that now gripped Versailles. The meticulously trimmed hedges that had once stood proud and vibrant now appeared less so, their edges starting to fray. The flowers, though still blooming, lacked the brilliance they once had, their colors muted as if they too could sense the dread that hung over the court. Philippe had always found solace in the gardens, their beauty a quiet reprieve from the noise of the palace. But now, even the tranquility of the gardens felt out of place, as if the world outside the palace was mirroring the decline within. The more Philippe wandered the halls and gardens, the more he felt a gnawing sense of stagnation. It was as though time had slowed. He had never been one to sit idly by, watching as the world turned around him. He was a man of action, and yet every move he made within the confines of Versailles seemed to come up against an invisible wall. The court, once a place of vitality and power, now felt like a place of waiting, a place where nothing ever seemed to change. But now, with the whispers of rebellion growing louder in his ears, Philippe found himself wondering whether this was the moment for change, whether he could be the one to ignite it. Rumors of a new dawn were spreading like wildfire through the court. whispers of revolution, of a shift in power that would come not from the king's heir, but from an entirely new direction. These rumors sent shivers down the spine of anyone who had witnessed the chaos that a revolution could unleash. The very word revolution carried with it memories of bloodshed, of broken families, of a nation torn apart. Yet, amidst the fear and trepidation, there was something else, something that Philippe could not ignore. There was hope too. Hope for renewal, for a fresh beginning, for a new France that would rise from the ashes of the old order, stronger and more resilient. The more Philippe thought about it, the more he realized that he too felt this sense of hope, even amid the fear. It had always been in his nature to seek out opportunities, to find the way forward when others were paralyzed by uncertainty. And now, as the palace seemed to rot from the inside out, as the old ways crumbled beneath the weight of their own corruption, Philippe began to wonder whether he might be one of the leaders the court so desperately needed. He was not a man of noble birth, but that didn't matter. There were leaders in history who had emerged from the most unexpected places. If he could seize the moment, if he could find a way to harness the forces of change swirling around Versailles, he could be a part of the new order that was beginning to take shape. The sun was setting behind the palace as Philippe made his way through the garden once again, the long shadows casting an eerie glow over the once vibrant grounds. The cool evening air filled his lungs, but it did little to calm the storm of thoughts raging in his mind. The king's illness, the court's uncertainty, the rising murmurs of rebellion, all of it was too much to ignore. Change was coming, and with it, the opportunity to shape the future. Philippe paused by the fountain, the water still and unmoving, reflecting the fading light of the evening sky. He stood there for a long time, watching the ripples that formed when a gentle breeze stirred the water, breaking the stillness for only a moment before the surface returned to calm. The future of Versailles, of France, was much like that water calm on the surface, but beneath it, turbulent and uncertain. The choice before him was clear. The old ways were crumbling. The palace was dying, and its future, his future, would depend on the choices made in the coming days. Philippe had always prided himself on being a man of action, a man who could rise to the occasion when the time came. That time had arrived. The decision to act, to shape the future of the court, lay in his hands. With a final glance at the fading light over the gardens, Philippe resolved to act. He would no longer sit idly by as the palace decayed. It was time to prepare for the coming change, to find those who would stand with him in this uncertain time. The fate of Versailles, of the monarchy, of France itself, rested on the decisions made in the coming days. And Philippe was ready to play his part in that story. Jean-Baptiste, the night watchman, had seen it all. He had spent countless nights patrolling the grounds of the palace, his eyes scanning every darkened corner, his ears attuned to every faint sound. He knew every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind through the trees, every whisper of movement in the shadows. The palace was vast, its halls endless, but Jean-Baptiste was its sentinel, its constant presence in the dark hours when the rest of Versailles slept. It was his job to watch over the palace when the king retired for the night, to guard the gates and ensure the safety of the royal family and their court. But over the years, Jean-Baptiste had come to believe that there was more to the night than simply standing guard. The darkness was not just a void. It was alive with its own secrets, with whispers that never reached the ears of those who lived in the light. On this particular night, the air was different. Jean-Baptiste could feel it the moment he stepped outside into the moonlit gardens. There was a chill that seemed to cling to the air, a biting cold that gnawed at his bones. The usual stillness of the palace was interrupted by something more unsettling. as if the very stones beneath his feet were restless, alive with energy that was foreign to him. It was a feeling he had grown familiar with in the past few weeks, but tonight it was sharper, more pronounced. He walked with caution, each step deliberate, his senses heightened. The soft rustling of leaves in the breeze seemed louder, almost too deliberate, as though something or someone was moving through the shadows just beyond his sight. As he made his way through the garden, his hand instinctively brushed the hilt of his sword. The palace, with all its beauty and splendor, had always been full of secrets. It was a place where the nobility played their games, where whispers of conspiracy and power floated through the air like perfume. Jean-Baptiste had never been naive enough to ignore the undercurrents that pulsed through the palace. He had seen enough to know that the grandeur of Versailles was a facade, hiding something darker beneath its surface. But tonight, there was something different, a palpable tension that hung in the air, an omen of something yet to come. A soft rustle from the far end of the garden caught his attention, pulling him from his thoughts. It was faint at first, like the whisper of silk brushing against stone. He stopped, standing perfectly still, listening intently. There it was again, a faint movement, followed by a whispering sound, as if the wind itself was carrying a voice. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. His heart began to race, not with fear, but with a growing sense of urgency. There was something out there, something he couldn't yet see, and it was moving closer. Jean-Baptiste knew the garden well. He had walked its paths 1,000 times. The shadows here were not unfamiliar to him, but tonight they seemed to have a life of their own, stretching long and deep, as though they were reaching for him. He moved quietly through the darkened garden, his eyes searching for the source of the sound. The moonlight bathed the trees in an ethereal glow, their ancient branches twisting like gnarled fingers reaching out of the earth. A figure cloaked in shadow stood motionless in the distance, barely visible against the backdrop of the darkened trees. It was impossible to make out any details at first, but there was something unsettling about the way it stood, unmoving, as if waiting for something. Jean-Baptiste's instincts told him to approach with caution. He drew his sword, the cold steel glinting faintly in the moonlight. "Who goes there?" he called out, his voice steady but laced with tension. The figure did not move, its presence unwavering. The silence that followed felt suffocating, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jean-Baptiste's grip tightened on his sword, and he took a step forward, every muscle in his body coiled with readiness. But then slowly the figure turned. As the moonlight caught the movement, Jean-Baptiste's breath caught in his throat. For a brief moment, he thought he had imagined it. The figure's eyes, gleaming like polished obsidian, seemed to reflect the pale light of the moon. They pierced through him, not just seeing his physical form, but seemingly staring into the depths of his soul. It was as if those eyes knew everything about him, everything he had ever thought or felt, everything he had hidden deep within himself. He froze, unable to move, his heart pounding in his chest. The world around him seemed to slow, the garden blurring into a dark haze as he locked eyes with the stranger. "Who are you?" Jean-Baptiste found his voice, though it sounded far too small in the vastness of the night. The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, it stood there, unmoving, as if savoring the moment. Jean-Baptiste's grip on his sword loosened slightly, uncertainty creeping in. This was no ordinary encounter, no simple intruder in the garden. There was something ancient, something unsettling about the figure. "You guard the night, but do you know what it truly holds?" The voice that broke the silence was both familiar and strange. It resonated with a deep, almost otherworldly quality, carrying with it an echo of something ancient. It felt like a question that had been asked before, a question that had lingered in the shadows of Versailles for longer than Jean-Baptiste could comprehend. The words hung in the air, their meaning heavy with implication. Jean-Baptiste felt a shiver run down his spine, not from fear, but from a deep, unsettling sense of recognition. This was not just a random figure, not just an intruder in the night. This was someone or something that had come to reveal a truth that he was not yet ready to hear. The weight of the question pressed against him, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The night was no longer just a backdrop to his duties. It had become something else, something much larger than himself. The shadows had come alive, and Jean-Baptiste was no longer just a watchman. He was a part of something bigger, something that had been waiting in the darkness, something that had been woven into the very fabric of Versailles itself. The line between the watcher and the watched, once so clear, now seemed to blur into obscurity. Jean-Baptiste's mind raced, his thoughts spinning with questions. What did the figure mean? What did it know? And most importantly, what was it that the night held, waiting to be uncovered? His hand tightened around the hilt of his sword, his instincts telling him to act, but his body refused to move. The figure before him was not an enemy to be vanquished. It was a mystery to be unraveled, a puzzle whose pieces were hidden in the dark corners of the palace. The figure's eyes never left him. There was no threat in the gaze, no malice, but there was something else, something that made Jean-Baptiste feel like a mere player in a game far larger than he had ever imagined. His thoughts, his actions, his very existence had been part of something greater, something that was unfolding now, in this very moment. The figure spoke again, its voice calm, yet filled with a knowing that made Jean-Baptiste's skin crawl. The night holds more than just the darkness. Jean-Baptiste. It holds the truth that you have been blind to. The palace, the king, the court, all are part of the illusion. But the night, the shadows, they reveal the hidden truths, the truths that will reshape everything you believe. Jean-Baptiste's heart hammered in his chest. His mind screamed to understand, to piece together the fragments of this cryptic conversation, but he was no closer to finding answers. The figure before him, this stranger, this apparition, was like a mirror, reflecting all the things Jean-Baptiste had never seen, had never wanted to see. The figure stepped back, its silhouette dissolving into the shadows of the trees. "We will meet again," it said, its voice fading into the wind. And with that, the garden was silent once more, leaving Jean-Baptiste standing alone, his sword still drawn, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. The night had revealed a glimpse of something much larger than he could comprehend, and as he slowly turned to return to his patrol, Jean-Baptiste knew that this was only the beginning. The secrets of Versailles were waking, and he was about to step into a world where the shadows held the truth, and the line between the known and the unknown was no longer so clear. Philippe had spent the night in the palace, restlessly pacing through the dim, echoing hallways, trying to make sense of everything he had uncovered. His mind was spinning, and though he tried to focus on the task at hand, the enormity of what he had learned weighed heavily on him. The king's illness, the rumors that had started to swirl through the court, the whispers of a curse, none of it added up. But what Philippe had overheard in the shadows that night suggested something much more sinister, something that could change the fate of Versailles, of the monarchy, and perhaps the very course of the kingdom. The rumors had been circulating for weeks, carried in hushed voices between courtiers and servants. The royal physicians, ever loyal to the crown, had remained tight-lipped about the true nature of the king's affliction. Some claimed it was poison, deliberate, calculated, a slow and insidious attempt on the king's life. Others said it was a curse, a punishment for the sins of the crown, a cruel twist of fate for a man who had once reigned over all of France with an iron grip. But Philippe had overheard something more troubling. There was a deeper truth behind the king's condition, a secret that was hidden beneath layers of deception and half-truths. He had overheard a conversation that night, a conversation between high-ranking courtiers, one that hinted at a conspiracy far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. And the more Philippe pieced the fragments together, the more it became clear this was no accident. The king had become a pawn in a much larger game, one that had been set in motion long before his illness began to take its toll. Philippe could no longer ignore the implications. The courtiers who once bowed and scraped before the king, eager for his favor, were now seeing an opportunity in his weakness. The king, diminished and vulnerable, was no longer the monarch he had once been. He was a man at the mercy of those who saw his fragile state as an opening for their own ambition. Those who had sworn loyalty to him now circled like vultures, their eyes fixed on the throne. They saw his suffering not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity to seize power for themselves. The darkness that had been brewing at Versailles had found fertile ground, and now it was spreading through the very heart of the palace. No one, it seemed, was safe from its reach. The very air of Versailles felt thick with treachery, with betrayal, and Philippe could sense it closing in. He knew he had to act quickly. Time was no longer a luxury he could afford. Every shadow seemed to conceal a secret, and every whispered conversation now carried the weight of conspiracy. He had trusted many within the palace, but now he couldn't help but wonder, who could he truly trust? The queen, perhaps? She had always appeared loyal to her husband, but could she be trusted in the face of such instability? Or what about the king's loyal guards, those men who had sworn an oath to protect the crown with their lives? Were they still loyal, or had their allegiances shifted, swayed by the uncertainty that now enveloped the palace? Philippe's thoughts raced as he hurried through the hallways, his steps quick and purposeful. He passed through the long corridors, the air cold against his skin, and headed toward the library, a place he knew well, a sanctuary of knowledge, a vault of hidden truths. If there was one place in Versailles where answers could be found, it was here. The library was a room filled with the knowledge of centuries, the collected works of scholars and philosophers who had passed through the halls of Versailles long before him. It was a space where secrets were kept, where forbidden knowledge was hidden among the dusty shelves. As he entered the library, the familiar scent of old parchment and leather-bound books greeted him. The room was dimly lit, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. The shelves, lined with ancient tomes, stretched high into the darkness, and Philippe could feel the weight of the knowledge contained within them. He moved quickly, pulling volume after volume from the shelves, searching for something, anything that could shed light on the mysteries that had been uncovered in the past few days. The king's illness, the whispers of poison, the rumors of rebellion, it was all connected. And Philippe knew that if he could find the right clues, the right documents, he might be able to piece together the full story. But as he rifled through the pages, his mind distracted by the enormity of what he was uncovering, a soft rustling noise caught his attention. Philippe froze, his heart leaping into his throat. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, a faint shuffling of feet against the stone floor. He turned quickly, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. Was someone else in the library? Who could it be, so late in the night? He stepped away from the shelves, his body tense, ready for whatever threat might be lurking in the shadows. The rustling sound grew closer, and Philippe felt the familiar stir of anxiety in his chest. Who else could be here at this hour? The silence of the library had always been a sanctuary for him, a place where he could escape the chaos of the court and find solace in the pages of history. But tonight, it seemed that even this sacred space could not offer refuge from the storm that was brewing within the palace walls. As the figure stepped into the dim candlelight, Philippe's breath caught in his throat. It was Adrian, his old friend, the one man in Versailles whom Philippe knew he could trust without question. Adrian's face was etched with worry, his eyes wide, as though he had seen something that had shaken him to his core. He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Philippe," Adrian said urgently, his words filled with an intensity that Philippe had not heard before. "We need to speak. I've discovered something that could unravel this entire conspiracy." Philippe felt a rush of relief flood through him. Adrian was here, and for the first time in what felt like days, he had someone he could confide in, someone who might have answers. The weight that had been pressing on his chest seemed to lift slightly, but the urgency in Adrian's voice reminded him that they were running out of time. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but they still had so much left to uncover. Philippe nodded, his mind racing with questions. "What have you found?" he asked, his voice low, barely a whisper in the quiet of the library. "Is it about the king's illness? What's really happening here?" Adrian's face darkened, his eyes scanning the library as though he feared someone might be listening. He took a deep breath, then spoke in a hushed tone. "It's worse than we thought," he said. "The king's illness, it wasn't just a natural ailment. Someone wanted him weakened. Someone has been poisoning him slowly, over time. I've traced it back to the court's own physicians. They've been complicit, working under the direction of someone higher up." Philippe's heart dropped. The king's illness, the whispers of poison, it was all true. But what did this mean for the monarchy? What did it mean for Versailles? "Who?" Philippe asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Who is behind it?" Adrian hesitated for a moment, glancing over his shoulder once more before answering. "I don't know yet, but the pieces are falling into place. We're looking at a conspiracy that goes deeper than we could have imagined. The king was never meant to survive this. And now, with the court in chaos, the time to act is running out." Philippe's mind raced as the gravity of the situation sank in. A conspiracy, a poisoning, betrayal from within the palace was no longer a sanctuary. It was a den of vipers, and the game being played inside its walls could destroy everything. The monarchy, the future of the nation, the very foundation of Versailles itself, were all at stake. "We need to find out who's behind this," Philippe said, his voice firm with resolve. "But we can't do it alone. We need allies, people we can trust." Adrian nodded, his eyes dark with the weight of the task ahead. "I've already been gathering information," he said, "but we need to move quickly. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes." "Olme." Philippe could feel the urgency in Adrian's voice. The storm that had been building within Versailles was about to break, and they had to be ready. There was no more time for hesitation, no more time for secrets. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows, and it was up to them to bring it into the light before it was too late. Together, they would uncover the conspiracy that threatened to tear the palace apart. Together, they would find the answers that could change the course of history. And perhaps, together, they would save the kingdom from the darkness that had already begun to take root within its walls. The court had splintered, fractured into competing factions that vied for control of the throne. Each group had its own ambitions, its own vision for the future, and each saw the king's decline as either a threat or an opportunity. Some still clung to the hope that the king's reign could be salvaged, that there was some way to preserve the monarchy despite his failing health. Others saw his weakness as their moment to seize power, to rise from the ashes of Versailles' decaying grandeur and shape the kingdom to their own will. The air was thick with whispers, thick with conspiracy. The tension, once subtle and barely perceptible, had grown to an almost unbearable pitch. It crackled through the palace like an electric current, too dangerous to ignore, too powerful to contain. There was no turning back now. The kingdom was teetering on the edge of something far darker, and no one knew exactly where the fall would end. Philippe had found himself swept up in this frenzy, drawn into the maelstrom of ambition, fear, and treachery that now defined the court. The slow unraveling of the palace, once majestic and proud, had become impossible to ignore. The whispers in the halls, the furtive glances exchanged behind closed doors, the subtle shifts in power, Philippe saw it all. He had watched the walls of Versailles begin to crumble, the grandeur of the past slipping away, replaced by a poisonous struggle for control. And now, as he walked through the halls of the palace, he could feel the weight of it on his shoulders, a burden he wasn't sure he could bear. The court, once a grand assembly of nobles and dignitaries, had become a house of cards. It was fragile, delicate, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. The kingdom had entered a period of uncertainty, a time where every move, every word spoken, could tip the balance between order and chaos. And Philippe, once content to watch from the sidelines, now found himself tangled in a web of intrigue. His once steadfast beliefs, his loyalty to the king and the crown, were being tested in ways he never anticipated. In this new reality, there was no clear path, no clear allegiance. Everyone around him had an agenda, a motive, and Philippe couldn't help but wonder, who could he trust? Which of the many factions would prove victorious, and which ones would leave him behind in the rubble? He had been a loyal servant to Versailles for years, but now loyalty seemed like a fragile thing, easily broken in the face of ambition. Despite the growing chaos that surrounded him, Philippe clung to a fragile sliver of hope. It was small, barely a flicker of light, but it was there. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a way to guide the kingdom away from the brink of disaster. Perhaps there was still a way to steer Versailles towards something better. He didn't know how or when, but he believed it. He had to. There were too many lives at stake, too much to lose, for him to simply give in to despair. He found solace, albeit fleeting, in the dimly lit corridors of the palace, walking the paths he knew so well. The marble floors beneath his boots seemed to echo with the weight of history, a history that now felt like a heavy burden rather than a proud legacy. The court had always been a place of whispered conversations, of hidden motives, but now those whispers were louder, more urgent, and more dangerous. Every shadow seemed to conceal a secret, every corridor a potential trap. Philippe's mind raced with possibilities, with plans and contingencies. Who would betray him? Who could he trust? Which faction would rise to power, and what would it mean for Versailles? The uncertainty gnawed at him. There was no turning back now. In the great hall, Philippe paused. The chandeliers overhead flickered with a hesitant light, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched across the stone floor, dancing like specters in the darkness. The room felt alive with the tension that had taken root in the palace. It was as though the very walls of Versailles could feel the impending storm, a tempest that was quickly approaching, ready to engulf them all. Philippe stood still for a moment, his heart beating a little faster as he listened to the voices that echoed through the hall. He wasn't alone. He turned, spotting two nobles near the towering columns, their faces tense with urgency. Their voices carried across the hall, low but sharp, filled with a kind of desperation that matched the atmosphere of the palace itself. Philippe moved closer, careful not to draw attention to himself, but his curiosity drove him to eavesdrop. He needed to understand what was happening, to hear firsthand what the factions were planning. "We must act swiftly," one of the nobles said, his voice edged with a quiet but determined urgency. "If we delay any longer, we'll lose our chance." His face was drawn, his brow furrowed with concern, as though the weight of the moment was pressing down on him. He looked around as if searching for the right words, for the courage to speak what was on everyone's mind. "The king's decline is a gift to us, but it won't last forever. We need to move, or the opportunity will be gone." "But the risks are great," the second noble replied, his voice tinged with caution. He was the opposite of the first, hesitant, calculating. "Do you not fear the consequences? If we act too soon, too recklessly, we could destroy everything we've worked for. The king may be weak, but he's still the monarch. To oppose him openly could mean the end of us all." The first noble leaned in closer, his voice dropping even lower, barely a whisper. "What if the king cannot save us? What if the crown is already slipping away? We are not the only ones who see the opportunity. There are others out there, waiting, watching. If we do not act, someone else will." Philippe's mind raced as he listened to the exchange. The court had already split, the factions forming before his eyes. But now, he realized there was something far more dangerous at play. There was a subtle, growing divide, not only between those who sought to preserve the monarchy, but between those who saw the king's decline as a moment to act, to reshape the kingdom to their own vision. And the deeper Philippe listened, the more he understood these men, these nobles, were not just speaking of a political shift. They were speaking of revolution. He turned away, his thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The stakes had never been higher. The kingdom's future, Versailles' future, was hanging by a thread, and the decision to act, whether to preserve the monarchy, to seize power, or to fight for change, was no longer a theoretical question. It was real, and it was coming for them all. The storm was gathering, and Philippe could feel the weight of it bearing down on him. The palace had become a place where loyalty and betrayal were indistinguishable, where the line between friend and foe blurred into obscurity. The whispers, the plans, the scheming, it was all part of a game, one with rules that no one seemed to understand. But Philippe knew one thing: he could not stay passive, not anymore. The time for hesitation was over. He had to choose a side, he had to act. But which side? The king's loyalists, those who still believed in the monarchy and its power, or those who believed the future lay in revolution, in tearing down the old ways and building something new. There were no easy answers. Every choice was fraught with danger, with consequences that would be felt for generations. As Philippe walked away from the great hall, his mind still racing, he resolved to keep his wits about him. He couldn't afford to be impulsive. This was not just about power, it was about the soul of the kingdom itself. And he had to be careful, deliberate. The storm was coming, but he would not be swept away by it. He would find a way to stand firm, to guide the kingdom toward the dawn of something better, something that could rise from the ashes of this crumbling court. The court was divided. The storm was gathering. But Philippe knew that the true battle was only just beginning, and he would play his part, no matter what it took. As the sun sank lower on the horizon, casting a golden hue across the palace grounds, an unsettling calm descended over Versailles. The sprawling gardens, once filled with the bustle of court life, now lay silent, as if the very earth beneath them could sense the storm that was gathering. In the chambers and corridors of the palace, courtiers convened in hushed
Would they
meetings.
seize the opportunity to build a society founded on the principles they had long yearned for? Or would the weight of old grievances and fears hold them back? As the day unfolded, The streets buzzed with conversations, people gathering in squares and markets to discuss the unfolding events. Ideas that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now spoken openly, the air thick with the thrill of possibility. Philippe wandered through the bustling streets, absorbing the atmosphere of a city on the brink of transformation. He saw the faces of those who had suffered under the old regime, now alight with a new sense of purpose. Artisans, merchants, and scholars mingled with peasants and laborers, all united by a common desire for change. In their eyes, he saw determination and courage, a readiness to embrace the unknown if it meant a chance for a better tomorrow. As the day wore on, Philippe made his way to a gathering in the heart of the city. It was a meeting of minds, a congregation of those who wished to discuss and debate the path forward. In the crowded hall, voices rose and fell, each speaker bringing their own vision for what Versailles might become. Some spoke of democracy and representation, others of justice and equality. All were driven by the same fundamental belief that the people of Versailles could shape their own destiny. Philippe listened intently, inspired by the passion and eloquence of those around him. He found himself drawn into the discussions, sharing his thoughts and ideas with those who had once been strangers. In that room, amidst the clamor and excitement, he felt the bonds of a new community forming, a community built not on power and privilege, but on shared hopes and dreams. As evening descended, the gathering slowly dispersed, but the energy lingered in the air. Philippe walked home through the quieting streets, the conversations of the day echoing in his mind. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, and that the struggle for a new Versailles had only just begun. But he also knew that he was not alone, that there were countless others ready to stand with him, to fight for a future where the voices of the many could not be silenced. The promise of a new dawn rested in their hands, and though the path was uncertain, Philippe felt a deep sense of hope. This was their moment, their chance to rewrite the story of Versailles, and he was ready to meet whatever came next with courage and resolve. Together, they would forge a new legacy, one that would echo through the ages as a testament to the power of the human spirit and the enduring dream of a just and equitable world.
Their words laced with urgency, their faces shadowed with uncertainty. The time of reckoning was near, and all who resided within the gilded walls knew it. The air seemed thick with anticipation, charged with the weight of secrets that had been long buried and now demanded to be unearthed. The whispers of revolution, once murmurs barely audible above the clinking of glasses and rustling of silks, had grown louder, taking on a ferocity that could no longer be ignored. Philippe stood on the balcony of his chambers, his eyes fixed on the sprawling gardens below. The last rays of sunlight danced across the paths, which wound through meticulously trimmed hedges and clusters of blooming flowers. The scent of jasmine lingered in the air, sweet yet tinged with something more bitter beneath the surface, something that made Philippe's stomach twist with unease. His hands gripped the cold stone of the balustrade, his knuckles white from the pressure. The calm before the storm, he thought, was always the most dangerous. It was the stillness that betrayed you, the quiet that made you believe you had time, only to find that you were standing at the precipice of something far larger than you could ever imagine. As the evening breeze rustled through the trees, Philippe's thoughts churned. He had never felt the weight of uncertainty more keenly than now. He could feel it pressing down on him, thick and heavy, suffocating in its intensity. The palace had always been a place of power, of beauty, of carefully orchestrated politics. But now, beneath the surface, the facade was cracking. The alliances he had once trusted, the friendships he had carefully nurtured, now seemed fragile, as if they too might crumble under the weight of what was to come. The rustling leaves seemed to echo in his mind, each sound like a ticking clock, reminding him that time was running out. The peace he had known, the order that had once reigned within these walls, was coming to an end. Philippe knew that the moment the palace's secrets were exposed, when the truth of the rebellion, the poison, the shifting alliances became public, nothing would ever be the same again. The kingdom would be irrevocably changed, and with it, the lives of everyone who had chosen to play the game of power within Versailles. Turning from the balcony, Philippe's gaze swept across the grand hall. The long corridors, adorned with portraits of past rulers, stretched before him like a gallery of silent witnesses, their painted eyes seeming to follow him, their gazes filled with judgment. He wondered what those long-dead kings and queens would think of the decisions he now had to make. What would they say about the alliances he had forged, the paths he had chosen in the name of peace, of trying to stave off the chaos that loomed on the horizon? Would they view him as a traitor or as a savior, a man trying to hold together a crumbling kingdom? He had no answers, and he didn't know if he ever would. The weight of their stares pressed against him, the ghosts of Versailles' past accusing him of daring to change the course of history. Philippe sighed, his thoughts a whirlwind of questions and doubts. He had never asked for any of this. He had never asked to be caught in the middle of a revolution, to stand at the crossroads of the old ways and the new. But here he was, standing on the edge, ready to make choices that would either save the monarchy or bring it to ruin. And he knew deep in his bones that there would be no turning back once the storm hit. His reverie was broken by the soft sound of footsteps approaching, light and measured. Philippe turned just as Lady Isabel appeared in the doorway. She moved with a quiet grace, her eyes steady, her posture calm yet resolute. Isabel was not just a trusted advisor to the king. She was a rare ally, someone who had stood beside him through many trials. And now, in this moment of uncertainty, her presence was a comfort. She stepped into the room with a quiet determination that mirrored his own. The weight of the palace's impending collapse, of the tension that seemed to be suffocating them all, hung between them like a fragile thread. But Isabel was not one to shy away from the storm. She had always known how to navigate the treacherous waters of Versailles, and Philippe was grateful for her strength now, when everything felt on the brink of unraveling. "Philippe," she said, her voice a soft balm against the growing anxiety that threatened to consume him. Her words carried the quiet authority that she always wielded so effortlessly. "We are ready." Philippe looked into her eyes, searching for reassurance, for some sign that he wasn't alone in this. He found it there, in the steadiness of her gaze. Isabel had always been someone he could count on, someone who knew how to keep her head even when the world around them seemed to be falling apart. She had been by his side during the king's declining health, during the unraveling of the court's once pristine order, and now, as revolution loomed, she was still standing firm. He nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling over him like a cloak. "Then let us face it together," he said, his voice firmer now, steadier. The storm was coming, and there was no way to stop it. But they would face it head on, together, as allies, as comrades, as those who still believed in the possibility of something better, something brighter, in the face of the impending darkness. Together, They would stand in the face of the storm. Together, they would fight for a future that was uncertain but not without hope. There was no certainty in what lay ahead, no guarantee that they would survive the coming chaos. But Philippe, standing there with Isabel by his side, felt a flicker of resolve burning within him, a glimmer of hope that, despite the odds, despite the uncertainty, they could still change the course of history. As the shadows lengthened in the grand hall and the air grew thick with the promise of upheaval, Philippe knew that the time to act had come. The revolution was no longer a whisper on the wind, it was here, and it was real. The only question now was how they would weather it, how they would fight for the future they all so desperately hoped for. He turned back to the window, his gaze once again drifting over the gardens below, the paths winding through the shadows. Somewhere out there, the courtiers were making their final moves, the factions closing in on their respective choices. But Philippe had made his. He would stand firm. He would fight for a future where Versailles did not fall to ruin, where the hopes of a brighter dawn were not snuffed out in the darkness. It was a small hope, but it was his. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt certain about something. Together, with Isabel, they would face the storm. Together, they would try to hold back the rising tide of revolution, to guide Versailles away from the edge of destruction. The challenge ahead would be insurmountable, the stakes higher than they had ever been. But Philippe knew that with allies like Isabel and with the strength of his own resolve, they might yet find a way to survive. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope, fragile, fleeting, but alive. The storm was coming, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could weather it together. The first light of dawn broke across the horizon, spilling its golden glow over the palace of Versailles, and with it, a new era began to unfold. The once glorious halls, now echoing with the weight of history, stood as silent witnesses to a changing world. The ornate marble floors and the gilded walls that had borne witness to the heights of opulence and power now seemed to fade into the background of something far more urgent, a moment of transformation that could not be ignored. The whispers of rebellion, which had been growing in the shadows, had erupted into a deafening roar. The old power structure, with its long-held traditions and ironclad rule, had shattered, leaving only the remnants of a once unified kingdom. The king's reign was over, but what would come next was uncertain. Philippe stood by the grand windows of the palace, watching as the sun's first rays illuminated the sprawling gardens below. The palace, once a symbol of royal grandeur, now seemed like a relic of a forgotten time. As the light broke through the trees and painted the marble paths with a soft glow, Philippe couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. The world was changing, and Versailles, for all its beauty, was no longer immune to the forces that had been stirring within it for so long. The silence of the morning was palpable, almost suffocating in its tension. A new chapter was beginning, but it was unclear whether it would bring renewal or ruin. The palace had always been a place of excess, of power, of endless feasts and celebrations that seemed to carry no consequence. But now, as the city streets slowly filled with the energy of the common people, as the former courtiers and nobles gathered in corners, hesitant in their purpose, it was impossible to ignore the shift that had taken place. What was once unthinkable now seemed inevitable. The Great Garden, the grand symbol of Versailles' untouchable wealth, had become the ground for something entirely different. It was no longer just a place of beauty, it was a battlefield of ideas, of hopes and dreams for a future not yet realized. Former courtiers, their silks and fine embroidery now a stark contrast to the humility in their demeanor, walked among the crowds, unsure of what role they had to play in this new world. They had spent their lives vying for favor, serving the whims of royalty, but now they found themselves in a world that seemed to be unraveling beneath their feet. They no longer had the certainty of their former lives, and though they held their heads high, the uncertainty that gripped the palace was unmistakable. They moved with a kind of cautious optimism, unsure whether the winds of change would blow in their favor or strip them of everything they had once known. Beneath the frescoed ceilings of the great hall, the heart of Versailles, a different kind of assembly was taking place. Here, in the midst of this shifting world, a group of visionaries had gathered. They were a mixture of young idealists, seasoned statesmen, and those who had spent years in the shadows waiting for their moment to step into the light. They were all bound by a shared belief in the possibility of a new France, a country where liberty, equality, and fraternity were no longer lofty ideals, but concrete goals that could be achieved. The room buzzed with a fervor that hadn't been seen in Versailles for generations. The air was thick with passion and ambition, the scent of ink and paper mingling with the anticipation of change. It was a time of transformation, where the echoes of the past were being steadily replaced by the whispers of a promising future. Ideas flowed freely, each word carrying the weight of hope and the promise of a better tomorrow. Debates were spirited yet respectful, as each participant knew the importance of their task. They were crafting the foundations of a nation reborn, where every citizen would have a voice and a stake in its destiny. Outside the Grand Hall, the gardens of Versailles remained as meticulously manicured as ever, a symbol of the old order's grandeur. Yet, even there, signs of change were evident. People gathered in small groups, discussing the latest developments, their faces lit with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, a reminder that amidst upheaval, life continued to blossom. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the palace, the former courtiers watched quietly from the sidelines. Though they found themselves at a crossroads, they couldn't help but feel the stirrings of something larger than themselves. Perhaps, in this new world, there was a place for them too, a chance to redefine their roles and contribute to the unfolding story of a nation seeking its true identity. And so, with the same cautious optimism that had guided them through the day, they resolved to embrace the uncertainty of tomorrow, ready to play their part in the grand tapestry of history. They spoke in heated tones, each word a challenge to the status quo, each sentence a declaration of a new direction for the kingdom. What had once been confined to the pages of books and the speeches of revolutionaries now seemed within reach. The palace's grand frescoes, depicting the triumphs of kings and queens long past, now seemed to look down upon them, perhaps in silent approval or perhaps in judgment. But these new voices, filled with purpose and determination, would not be silenced. The world outside Versailles had already begun to change, and now, inside these hallowed walls, a new order was taking shape. The people spoke of equality of a world where birth and privilege no longer determined one's fate. They spoke of liberty, the right to speak, to choose, to live without the oppressive hand of a monarch over them. And they spoke of fraternity, of unity, of coming together to build a future that embraced the dignity of every citizen. The conversation was not easy. There were those who feared the cost of such change, who believed that the old order could still be salvaged, that there was a way to preserve the monarchy while adopting reforms. But the majority were resolute. They knew that the time for compromise had passed. The old ways had failed, and now it was time to forge a new path, no matter the cost. Outside the walls of the palace, the energy of the people swelled. It was as if the city of Versailles itself had shed its old skin, its ties to the monarchy and the court's decadence, and was embracing something new. The streets, once quiet and empty, now pulsed with life. Crowds gathered in the town square, in the narrow alleys and cobbled streets, their voices raised in excited discussion. They spoke of the king's illness, of the rumors that swirled in the air like smoke. They spoke of the possibility of a new order, a new beginning, and they spoke of the justice that was long overdue. For the first time in many years, the people of Versailles felt they had a voice that could not be ignored. The aristocracy, once so distant and aloof, now seemed distant and fragile. Their power, once absolute, had been chipped away by the growing discontent of the people. They could no longer hide behind their gilded walls, their silks and jewels, their titles and estates. The city was alive with the sound of new ideas, new dreams, and though the future remained uncertain, the promise of something better was enough to fuel the hearts of those who had been silenced for too long. Philippe, though caught in the whirlwind of these turbulent times, stood apart. His role was not yet clear, and though he had aligned himself with the visionaries, he knew the path forward would not be easy. He had witnessed the collapse of the old guard, but even in the midst of this chaos, he still believed that something of value could be salvaged. Perhaps, in the wake of all this upheaval, a new vision for Versailles could emerge, one where the values of justice, equality, and hope were more than just words on paper. But the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. Even as the city brimmed with energy, Philippe could feel the storm that lay beneath it all. The court was in disarray, and the revolution was coming. There was no stopping it now. But as the first rays of sunlight touched the golden facade of Versailles, Philippe could not help but feel that perhaps this was a moment in history that could be shaped, a moment that would be remembered not for its chaos and bloodshed, but for the hope it brought to those who believed in change. The pages of history were turning, slowly but inexorably, and the future of Versailles was unfolding with every decision made in these tense hours. The old order was breaking, and with it came the chance for something new, something brighter. Philippe didn't know what would happen in the coming days or weeks, but he knew that, for the first time in his life, he was a part of something much larger than himself. The dawn of a new era was not just a moment, it was a movement. And he, like so many others, was standing at the crossroads of history, unsure of what would come next, but determined to help shape the future. The sun rose higher, casting its light on a world that was no longer the same. The court, the city, the kingdom, everything had changed. And now, the question remained, what would the people of Versailles do with the promise of a new dawn? And so, as the final echoes of our story fade into the night, we are left with the question that has haunted every soul in the halls of Versailles. What happens next? The fate of a kingdom, of a nation, and of its people now rests in the choices that were made and in the choices still to come. Philippe's journey, like so many others, reflects the challenges of a time when the very foundations of power were crumbling beneath the weight of ambition, fear, and hope. The whispers of rebellion may have grown louder, but the heart of Versailles still beats with the possibility of change. Whether that change leads to destruction or to renewal, we will have to wait and see. But one thing is certain, the revolution has begun, and no one will emerge from it unchanged. If you've enjoyed this journey through history, through the whispers of Versailles, then don't forget to let us know. Like this video if you've been captivated by the twists and turns of our story, and share it with those who you think would love to experience the intrigue and drama of Versailles. We'd love to hear your thoughts and theories on what comes next. Comment below, and let's dive into discussion. What do you think of Philippe's choices? Will he navigate the storm, or will he be swept away by the tides of revolution? And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any of the upcoming chapters. We've got so much more in store for you. The story of Versailles is far from over, and we're just getting started. Stay with us as we continue to unfold the tale of a kingdom on the edge, where the dawn of a new era is just beginning to rise. Thank you for being with us tonight. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning the past, because sometimes it's the stories of old that teach us the most about where we're headed.